Now you might be expecting a video on car crashes and Adidas apparel, but we're actually going to talk about high literature. Specifically, we're going to talk about magical realism, which is a genre of literary fiction where things that we would consider extraordinary or supernatural are just sort of normal. At the same time, normal things that are extraordinary are treated exactly the same as if they would happen in our world. For instance, you could have a detective story where one of the main characters is a ghost. Nobody would ever remark upon the fact that that character is a ghost, even though everybody would know that that character is a ghost. They would say, hey, can you maybe float through that wall to see if there's a secret room behind it? And then the ghost would do that. People would know about the ghostliness of the character, but it wouldn't be anything special. At the same time, if a car bomb goes off during that narrative as part of some sort of terrorist plot or whatever, people would react to it in exactly the same way as they would in our world. And the thing is, people will treat the ghost as normal, even if he is the only ghost in the entire narrative. In Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, a dude turns into a cockroach. And then all that happens is his family and himself try to adapt to the fact that he's now a sort of cockroach-man hybrid. And that's really all that happens. There's no scientists or journalists that come around and go, oh, look at this weird phenomenon, let's study it, let's write about it in the newspaper. And though we are never explicitly told that people turning into cockroaches is just something that happens sometimes, it is implied that this is normal by the way that the characters react to it. In most genres that feature magic, magic is always something that is extraordinary, it's out there, it's a source of mystery. You want to know how it works, and the characters want to know how it works. They don't quite understand the mechanics behind it. In magical realism, nobody cares. It's not a source of mystery, even if the characters not always understand what is going on. It's just going on like you and I would go buy cookies at the supermarket. Now, what magical realism is not is urban fantasy, because urban fantasy heavily features the theme of the masquerade, of the society of supernatural beings and magic hiding from the real and mundane world. Whereas in magical realism, there is absolutely no distinction made between the supernatural and the mundane world. And though the name sounds like it, magical realism also isn't hard fantasy, where you would have magic systems explained to you in a way that you understand all of their underlying logic, and they sometimes even follow the laws of physics. As a matter of fact, in magical realism, nobody will ever tell you the rules of the magic. Because if you would read just any other book, nobody would tell you the rules of how traffic works either. It's just assumed that that is something that people understand. And because magic is about as mundane as driving cars in magical realism, it also isn't explained to the reader because all of the characters already understand it. You might even make the argument that magic never exists in magical realism because only the juxtaposition of their world and our world as the readers creates the illusion that magic is something that exists over there. There's also a very important factor. For this juxtaposition to have any effect, stories of magical realism cannot be set in secondary worlds, because that would just be mundane fantastic, where you have a fantasy world where people just accept that wizards are a thing. No, they have to be set in our world. And you might assume that this is just a thing that is a thing, because fantasy has so many subgenres, and every single one of them has a new word for every variable that, of course, something like magical realism is bound to exist as a term, right? But try telling someone who is a fan of literary fiction that magical realism is basically just fantasy, and you will get slapped in the dick. Magical realism was not invented by fans of fantasy. Magical realism as a term was invented by the people who enjoy the highbrow, intellectual, smart people literature stories. You know, the people who teach English classes and go to fancy libraries and read stories that usually do not feature any magic because magic, such a childish thing. But at the end of the day, magic is kind of cool. And so because they wanted to have magic, they just went, oh look, there's this whole literary genre that Latin people wrote in South America. We will just use it, call it magical realism, and decide that it is elevated above the genre rebel. And that is how magical realism came to be. The first, biggest, and flagship stories of magical realism come, as I already said, from South America. Why is this? Well, South America is a weird place. It's not naturally weirder than any other place, but it is a place where very extreme things like wars and famines and all that shit have happened very frequently and very commonly over the course of the past few centuries. It is a violent place where traumatic things that we would consider rare are just commonplace. Yet it is also a place where you have a lot of very highly educated, intelligent artists and writers. Just look at the history of South America. Look at all the wars, civil or external. Look at all the slavery and the violence that has gone on that continent. All the unspeakable things that have been perpetrated there. All the clashes. It's unsurprising that in a place where murder and rape and all of these horribly traumatic and inhumane things are so commonplace, there would be a theme in literature of things that are supposed to be impossible being 100% mundane. Artists often express the collective consciousness of the culture from which they emerge, and that is a theme that is very popular in that specific place. And this is the point of the video where we come to the bleh. Modern-day Russia is a strange, impoverished place that is recovering from decades of cultural repression. Much like in South America, horrible circumstances in which nobody wants to live are considered normal in many parts of Russia, and people just exist with them. The dichotomy of what the human being is capable of surviving in and what it actually has to deal with in Russia and how normal it is there is fertile ground for something like magical realism to develop independently of the comparable literary tradition in South America. I mean, getting 110% of the vote in an election is not the only magical thing that can happen to you in the motherland. I actually recently saw a video of a loud Russian guy, unarmed, just chasing a family of bears who were terrified of him. In many late Soviet and especially post-Soviet works of fiction in Russia, which has a very strong literary tradition throughout history, one can see a lot of symptoms of this magical realism, though it is expressed mostly as the magic or mundane kind of thing that you would find in things like Fargo, which doesn't strictly speaking fit the genre definitions, but it is a symptom of the same coping mechanism for long-term trauma that Russian culture is currently going through. An excellent example for this is this very book right here, Metro 2033. You may have read the book, you may have played the video game. In it, the mythology that the people have created about the subway system, the folklore, the demons and the monsters and all that, and the ghosts and the spirits, they are all presented as real, even though we're not confronted with them a lot. We can assume that they are, in some capacity, reality. But it's still a post-apocalyptic story. It's not a story about ghosts. There are just things that you could interpret to be ghosts quite easily. Or there's this whole scene where they go into a lockdown section of the metro, and there's this myth about this worm that eats the tunnels. And the main character, Artyom, just sees this worm passing by somewhere, and we're not sure what that is. Is that one of the trains, or is that really some sort of magical creature? Like South America, and really any place, Russia also has a lot of highly interesting folklore to deconstruct, though, as it tends to be in magical realism, all of the deconstructing tends to go on in the background, and you just get the deconstructed product, and they just expect you to fucking know what's going on. I myself tried writing a short story in magical realism a while ago, and I found that Russia was just a natural fit for it. You can find it in the description, you can find the audiobook and PDF in the description. It's really quite short, it's only 700 words long, and I think it's one of my very best. Russia is, in some ways, in and of itself, post-apocalyptic, and a post-apocalyptic culture has developed in it. The Soviet Union existed for decades, and it exerted punishment on the people and the culture of Russia for just that long. This is why you don't really have a lot of magical realism type stuff written in post-World War II Germany, because it was generally, even though Germany had been utterly destroyed, a period of optimism and looking forward to the future, because Germans didn't really have much love for the Nazis, generally speaking, and things like the Marshall Plan and the Wirtschaftswunder helped us get us back to our feet very quickly. You do, however, have this a lot in post-World War I Germany, which is not a period that was incredibly long, and you only have a few writers like Kafka going into this kind of thing. But it is indicative of like a long-term, horrible situation that we as a culture, as a collective psychology, are trying to get through. A comparable place where you would have this sort of slow trauma, where I expect a certain literary tradition of magical realism to emerge over the coming decades, is the United States Rust Belt. People there are impoverished. It is a strange place full of already existing mythology that is absolutely fascinating, that mixes very old Native American mythology and new mythology. You know, the kind of stuff imported by the people who moved there, the Europeans, and also created by America just being America. And you hear a lot of very strange stories out of the Rust Belt. The fact that they are also utterly impoverished and left behind by the rest of their microcosm makes them distinct from places like Florida, where a lot of weird shit happens, which I've done a video on this. It mostly happens because it is reported a lot. There's not a very dramatic increase in frequency there. But Florida is actually quite wealthy. There are a lot of very wealthy people in Florida, and these stories are more the exception than the rule. Nobody who has a lot of money decides to move to the Rust Belt. They all go to fucking Florida or California. Now, of course, none of this is to say that you couldn't write a great magical realism story in a place that hasn't gone through this sort of slow trauma and who isn't fit to host magical realism. And it is also not to say that you have to be from a culture that has such a literary tradition, because of course you don't. You could set a story of magical realism in present-day Sydney, where everything is fine, and it could be great. Also, technically speaking, Shadowrun meets all the hallmarks of magical realism. It is a world in which there is magic, that is our world, and that magic is considered mundane and just a normal thing. It is deconstructed by society. And also, in most Shadowrun narratives, magic is rarely the source of the mystery. It is often a tool employed by forces that are in the universe. But those forces are at the end of the day the mystery, not the, oh, this is magic and this is magical and weird type situation. But of course, no serious lit fascist will ever consider Shadowrun magical realism, and I wouldn't even want them to. I mean, they have to protect their fort against the plebeians of genre fiction, and Shadowrun is too cool. At the end of the day, all of these distinctions and definitions are interesting, but ultimately neither relevant nor set in stone. Just sort of write what you want to write, and just sort of read what you want to read. And don't worry too much about the details. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe. Actually, leave me in the comments, leave some stories maybe. That you have lived in South America or Russia, or just leave your opinion on how stupid or how necessary the distinction is between magical realism as a piece of literary fiction and, you know, magic in just general fantasy genre fiction. Go on the Twitch. I don't know what I'm going to be streaming tonight. It's definitely not going to be This Is the Police 2, because what the fuck is that game? Come on the Discord server. Consider giving me money over Patreon, and you will get some cool stuff out of it. Also on the Discord server, really the Discord server is the best part of this channel. Don't even watch the videos, just go on the Discord server and have fun there, honestly. In that spirit, I appreciate you all. Go read a book, or don't, I don't really care. And see you around, cunts.